On Thursday, November 13th, Port Charles becomes the kind of place where trust evaporates in a heartbeat and every security camera angle begins to look like a confession. At the center of the storm stands Britt, a woman who has clawed and bled her way back from her worst mistakes, only to realize that the person she finally dared to rely on has just put a knife squarely in her back. Jen Sidwell, the smooth-talking power player who talked about progress and miracles and second chances, makes a choice that turns Britt from partner into expendable liability in a single, devastating move. It is not a loud betrayal. There is no dramatic announcement or theatrical showdown. Instead, it's the quiet, bureaucratic kind of treachery. Signatures on a document that shifts blame, a phone call made at the exact wrong moment, a calculated silence when her name is dragged into the dirt. And when Britt finally understands what he's done, the threat that leaves her lips is not the impulsive outburst of the woman she used to be. It is cold, deliberate, and very, very real. For weeks, Sidwell has wrapped himself in the language of innovation and salvation. The research lab he bankrolled was marketed as a place where hopeless diagnoses met bold science, experimental treatments, radical regimens, the sort of work that lived in the gray area between genius and catastrophe. Britt, with her sharp mind and damaged heart, seemed like the perfect recruit. She knew what it meant to be judged. She also knew what it meant to stand in front of a patient and want, more than anything, to change the ending of their story. So she let herself believe him. She convinced herself that working with Sidwell was her shot at redemption. Heal enough people and maybe, just maybe, the shadow of her past would finally recede. But on November 13th, that illusion shatters when word filters back that the lab has been broken into. Alarms tripped in the middle of the night. Doors forced. Files accessed. Equipment disturbed. In a single report, everything they have been building together is redefined, not as pioneering medicine, but as a crime scene. And before Britt even has time to catch her breath, her name is already being floated as the logical suspect. After all, who else knew the layout of every room, the codes to every lock, the placement of every restricted file? Who else had both the motive and the knowledge, according to Jen Sidwell's carefully crafted version of events? Not him, of course. Never him. What makes the betrayal so brutal is that Britt is not anywhere near that lab when the break-in happens. She is at General Hospital, doing the very thing she once took for granted and now clings to like a lifeline, practicing medicine. She is on the floor, chart in hand, listening to a worried family ask the sort of questions she understands all too well. She checks vitals, orders tests, fights to keep her mind anchored in the immediate and the tangible. The hospital's fluorescent lights, the controlled chaos of the nurses' station, the urgent calls over the intercom, these are familiar, grounding. When the call comes in about the lab, it feels like a foreign language crashing into a life she is desperately trying to normalize. Almost instantly, a timeline forms that seems, on paper, damning. A security camera shows someone using her access credentials. A witness remembers seeing a car that looks exactly like hers near the facility. The system logs record her ID opening doors she never touched that night. The narrative almost writes itself: brilliant doctor, ethically complicated past, high-pressure research, and a suspicious breach. It is the kind of story that spreads faster than any official report. The only problem is that it is not true. The tiny, haunting detail that might save her, or sink her entirely, is something so ordinary it barely registers at first: her car keys. Britt has this vague, nagging memory of her keys not being where she expected them to be. A moment of searching, a prickle of irritation, the assumption that she simply misplaced them in the chaos of her day. She finds them eventually, tossed where she swears she didn't leave them, and forces herself to shrug it off because she has rounds, and responsibilities, and no time to indulge in paranoia. Now, with the lab in shambles and suspicion circling, that small, dismissed moment becomes enormous. What if the keys were taken, used, and slipped back into her life like a loaded weapon placed in her hand without her consent? The question hovering in the air is whether Silas knows. Silas Clay has never exactly been one to ignore inconsistencies, especially when tools, data, or access points don't line up. If anyone could sense that something is off about Britt's timeline, about a car that appears to move without its owner and a keycard that seems to unlock doors on its own, it is him. But even Silas can only work with what he knows, and Britt has not allowed herself to fully articulate, even to him, the part that terrifies her the most: that someone walked right through her life, borrowed her identity in the form of stolen keys and cloned credentials, and used her as a shield for their own agenda. In the whispers around town and the buzzing group chats of the younger crowd, rumors start to form. Maybe it was the kids, the restless, reckless generation that treats locked facilities as challenges, not boundaries. Maybe someone younger, smarter with tech, took advantage of a moment when Britt's guard was down, copying her access, lifting her keys, and staging a break-in that looks less like a clumsy burglary and more like a surgical strike. It's an ugly thought, because it suggests that this isn't just about Sidwell's betrayal or corporate greed. It suggests a network, a wider circle of hands and minds who decided that Britt's life, her reputation, even her freedom were acceptable collateral damage. And then there is Jens Sidwell himself, the man who should be panicking at the mere idea of his precious lab being compromised. In public, he does just that, performing outrage, playing the victim, vowing full cooperation with any investigation. He talks about data integrity and stolen breakthroughs, about the tragedy of science being sabotaged. But in private, with Britt, his tone shifts. His panic is sharper, more specific, and pointed dangerously in her direction. He suggests that she should get ahead of the story. He hints that it might be better for everyone if she accepts a carefully orchestrated narrative that leaves him untouched. When she refuses, realizing exactly what he is doing, turning her into the scapegoat who takes the fall so that his empire remains polished, something inside her hardens. The threat she makes is not impulsive. It is the promise of a woman who has been underestimated for the last time. While Britt's world tilts on its axis, another story begins to unfold across town at the Port Charles Police Department. Nathan West, carrying the lingering weight of his own past cases and broken promises, is introduced to a familiar name with a new edge: Detective Harrison Chase. Chase has returned to the PCPD, and the reunion is not the casual workplace catch-up one might expect. There is urgency in the air, a sense that the department is bracing for something bigger than the usual stream of domestic disputes and bar fights. Dante Falconeri, grounded as ever in a mixture of skepticism and gut instinct, stands beside them as the third point in a triangle that could either stabilize an investigation or tear it apart. Jason Morgan once filled the role of the outsider who could see patterns cops missed, but this time, the weight is on Nathan and Chase to become that sharp lens. Nathan carries a deeply ingrained sense of justice, tempered by the painful realization that the system can be manipulated. Chase, having been away and then drawn back into this world, walks in with something to prove and a quiet determination not to repeat past mistakes. Dante, for his part, has seen enough dirty deals and half-truths to know that the obvious suspect is almost never the true culprit when powerful people are involved. When information about the lab break-in lands on their desks, it doesn't look like a simple burglary to any of them. The use of a doctor's credentials, the timing of the breach, the selective nature of what was accessed and what was left untouched, these are marks of an operation with a purpose. Nathan begins to dig into personnel records and access logs, tracing the pattern of who was where and when. Chase focuses on the technical side, examining security footage, digital logs, and any gaps that might indicate tampering. Dante, watching the two of them work, begins to ask the questions no one else wants to voice. Who benefits if Britt is destroyed, and why are they so confident the evidence will support that outcome? The more they pull at the threads, the stranger the tapestry becomes. The car that appeared near the lab is captured only in profile, license plate conveniently obscured. The keycard records show activity in places that contradict other verified timestamps, as if someone has carefully overlaid false data onto real events. There are hints of an internal override on the security system, something that would require both high-level access and intimate familiarity with how the lab operates. Jen Sidwell, of course, presents himself as the injured patron, demanding answers and pressuring the PCPD to make a swift arrest. He wants the story to be clean, contained, quickly resolved. But Nathan, Chase, and Dante have all seen what happens when an investigation is rushed to satisfy a powerful man's schedule. They recognize the danger of locking in on Britt too fast, no matter how convenient her supposed involvement appears. As they re-examine witness statements, a new picture begins to emerge. Britt's verifiable presence at General Hospital during the crucial windows, minor yet telling inconsistencies in the stories of people closer to Sidwell than they first realized, rumors of younger accomplices who may have been paid or coerced into playing a part they didn't fully understand. Britt, meanwhile, stands at an emotional crossroads. She knows better than most that her past makes her an easy target. She can feel eyes on her in the corridors of the hospital, can hear the hesitations in people's voices when they say her name, as if they're wondering whether the woman who once crossed so many lines has finally gone too far. The sting of that unspoken accusation, layered on top of Sidwell's calculated betrayal, pushes her dangerously close to the edge. She can run, as she has tried before. She can retreat, surrendering to the narrative others are writing for her. Or she can fight, with every piece of evidence, every ally, every buried instinct for survival she still possesses. What Britt cannot yet see is that her choice will intersect directly with the new alliance forming at the PCPD. Nathan's growing suspicion that Britt is more pawn than mastermind, Chase's refusal to ignore digital anomalies just because they are inconvenient, and Dante's steady insistence on following the money rather than the noise will drag all three men deeper into a web that stretches far beyond one broken-into lab. When they eventually cross paths with Britt, the meeting will not simply be detective and suspect. It will be the convergence of people who know what it means to be misjudged, manipulated, and pushed to the brink. November 13th becomes more than just a date on the calendar. It is a line drawn in the sand for everyone involved. For Britt, it is the day she realizes that trusting Jen Sidwell may be the most dangerous decision she has ever made, and that surviving his betrayal will require a version of herself she isn't sure she still has the strength to become. For Sidwell, it is the day his carefully controlled facade begins to crack, as detectives who refuse to be steered start asking the wrong questions at exactly the wrong time. And for Nathan, Chase, and Dante, it is the beginning of a case that will test not just their skills but their convictions, forcing them to decide whether justice in Port Charles is something they uphold, or something they'll have to fight their own system to reclaim.